This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that warm introduction. The title of my talk tonight is The Brief Story of How Work Took Over the World and Made Us Who We Think We Are. These are strange days for workers, not mere anarchy, as a poet W.B. Yeats once put it in his poem, The Second Coming, but rather utter bewilderment is loosed upon the world. Work is totally out of whack, and that's not even the root of it. For is it not strange that the first thoughts that come to mind in the morning upon waking up have to do with work, with scheduling and rescheduling, with meetings and deadlines, with tasks and projects and more tasks? And is it not stranger still that the second question we ask one another upon meeting for the first time is, "So Jane, what do you do for a living?" And "So John, what do you do for a living?" And then we go on to talk about what it is that we do for a living long into the evening, at which time we come home and ask our children, "So Bob, so Sue, what do you want to be when you grow up?" As if that were still a relevant question to ask in this, the digital age. And is it not stranger still, moreover, that the very quality of the work we do today is so often shot through not with any kind of busyness, but rather with crazy busyness? We say that we are crazy busy right now, so crazy busy that we couldn't possibly make this social engagement or that one, and can we kindly reschedule for sometime 6 months from now? On the one hand, this sense of being crazy busy is leading us to feel overwhelmed to the point, in some cases, of burnout. While on the other hand, it is a source of secret pride, for do we not marvel at our schedules, at our calendars, as we see them all filled up? And is it not stranger still, moreover, that while some of us have too much work to do and too little time to do it, and therefore are experiencing time famine, others have too little work to do, and as a consequence are barely eking out a living? Gig workers in the gig economy, those working for TaskRabbit and Uber and Amazon Mechanical Turk, and platforms that you and I have never heard of, when asked by interviewers, "What do you want most from your life right now?" will answer quite candidly, financial stability. And yet for many, financial stability is not to be had. And is it not stranger still, moreover, that the very architects and engineers in Silicon Valley who have designed these platforms are all the while living in a place that touts the glories and virtues of hustle porn and glamour toil? Gary Vee, for example, is a Silicon Valley guru who claims or boasts that over the past 25 years, he has worked 18-hour days. Or consider the example of Melissa Meyer, former tech CEO at Yahoo, who, when asked by an interviewer, "How many hours a week do you work?" replied, quite matter-of-factly, 130. How is that even possible? Well, it is possible, it turns out, she said, if you're very careful about how long you sleep and when, if you're especially careful about how often you eat and how long it takes, and if you're most especially careful about when you go to the bathroom and how often. And the ancient Greeks would have marveled at this, saying to themselves, how is it possible that someone in such a position of power could be living a life that is akin to a chattel slave? And is it not stranger still, moreover, that millennials, those who are born and bred to be high-achieving total workers, are, as one Huffington Post writer so elegantly put it, getting screwed by the system. For they are highly educated, are deeply in debt, are living in cramped apartments in Brooklyn and Oakland, are doing crappy, or in the words of David Graeber, bullshit jobs, and all the while are dreaming of fulfilling work, of socially impactful work, of meaningful work, of creative work. And in many cases, their dreams are going un or half fulfilled. And I come now to the strangest, indeed the darkest place in this world of total work, the place where illness meets work, where work meets death. A conversation partner with whom I've been speaking over the years, a man who is at once a poet and a lawyer, a couple of years ago nearly worked himself to death, with the tragic consequence he is now unable to be gainfully employed due to long-term chronic disability. And he is not alone, and it gets worse. A Japanese journalist in June 2013 ended up working 159 hours of overtime that month. She subsequently died. And she is not alone. A Silicon Valley lawyer, a man taken to overusing drugs, ended up taking too many drugs on a particular occasion. Nevertheless, he felt compelled to hop on a business call. His ex-wife found him lying, surrounded by vomit, dead on the floor. These, as I say, are strange days for workers, and utter bewilderment is loosed upon the world. What sense can we possibly make of all this? To catch a first glimpse of what I mean to argue tonight, I would like to invite you to take part in an extended thought experiment with me. A thought experiment which I call, why not, magic rooms. Imagine that you and I and everyone who has ever existed have only ever existed within these magic rooms. And therefore, the only thing we know is the inside of a particular room and the doorways that lead on to another room. And this goes on, so far as we can tell, indefinitely. And imagine that one fine day, you step into a particular room and the room is labeled tasks. And immediately, your mind is completely filled up with tasks. Those pertain to the past, to the present, and to the future. And not only this, but also all the tasks that anyone has ever finished, is in the midst of finishing, or shall finish. Therefore, your mind is nothing, so long as you're in that room, but tasks upon tasks upon tasks. Suppose you walk into the next room, and let's say it's labeled projects, and immediately your mind is filled up with projects, those dealing with the past, the present, and the future, as well as with all the other projects ever completed in the past, in the midst of being completed in the present, or on into the future. And then you walk into a third room, and that room is labeled meetings, and your mind is completely filled up with meetings. And you come to a fourth room, and why not? Perhaps it is called careers, and your mind is completely filled up with careers. And you come to a fifth room, and your mind is completely filled up, perhaps, with work-life balance. And this goes on, so far as you can tell, indefinitely. Perhaps being a precocious person, you might ask yourself, what is it that all these magic rooms have in common? And the answer, if the concept actually existed there, would be work. But that would not yet be even close to the heart of the matter. So let's suppose, given this is a magical thought experiment, that one day in particular you look into the corner of a room and there you find a small door. Out of curiosity, you move toward the door. you open it, you get on hands and knees, you crawl on through to the other side. When you stand up on the other side, what might you see? The truth is, you'd have no words to describe what this greater world was like. And yet, if you turned around and looked back at these magic rooms, you might find yourself with a burning, pressing question. And that question would be, what is behind all this? What is driving all this? What is it out of which, on account of which, and through which all of this has arisen, is arising, and continues to rise? And you wouldn't possibly know the answer to that question. But given that this is a magical thought experiment, perhaps a sign falls from the sky and into your hands. And on that sign, you read the words total work. And you wouldn't yet know what total work meant, but perhaps you could surmise that total work just was what was driving all this, just was what was behind all this, just was that out of which all of this had arisen, is arising, and continues to arise. And if that is what you thought indeed, I think you'd be on the right track. Total work, I've come to believe, is behind all this. It was in June 2017 that I discovered the nature and reality of total work. You see, each day I speak with individuals from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, from Scandinavia to South America, about the nature of a good life. Together we ask and seek to answer the most basic questions of human existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What is this all about? And indeed, what is the nature of a good human life? But something very strange, peculiar, vexing, paradoxical, puzzling began to occur to me after about 20,000 hours of philosophizing with people. Why, of all the things we could speak about under the sun, God, love, history, metaphysics, economics, politics, etc., did all these people who had never met each other before want to speak of their own accord about work, about their successes and their failures, their ups and their downs, their hopes and their dreams, and above all, their miseries? Why was that? Of all things, they wanted to speak about this. And I didn't know the answer until my wife happened to have sent me 2 cultural artifacts in June 2017 that together revealed to me that we are born to, or we believe that we are born to, that we are living to, and that we are dying to work today. Consider the first scene. A young boy named Nathaniel, in June 2017, graduates from kindergarten, and his mother is noticeably proud. She praises him for his work ethic, and that gained at such a young age. Evidently, Nathaniel's teacher must have asked him as well as his fellow classmates to write about their favorite thing about kindergarten. And the teacher must have also asked them to depict their hopes and dreams. Being a precocious young boy, Nathaniel takes the hopes and dreams and construes them in terms of a goal, and then he takes the writing assignment to be the means or path by which he is going to achieve that goal. You can see that his hopes and dreams have to do with becoming, I take it, a CEO of a company. They're therefore sitting in a boardroom and having a meeting. Meanwhile, outside, 3 lonely, well-manicured trees stand in the distance. And how is Nathaniel going to achieve this dream, this goal of being a CEO? He writes, "My favorite thing about kindergarten is working, because I was born to work." Notice we did not say my favorite thing was recess or playtime or drawing or painting or friendships or story time or whatever. No, he said working. And so the German term kindergarten, meaning garden for kids, ought here to be recast as Kinderarbeit, that is, work for kids, or child labor, or child work. For what Nathaniel has imbibed in this at such a young age is a long-standing, indeed abiding cultural belief that human beings' very reason for existence today was, is, and shall be to work. To wit, we think that we now live to work. Come now to that second story. Around the same time, in June 2017, a New York Times article appeared, one in which the interviewer, or rather the journalist, said that if you're considering retirement at this stage in your life, you would do well to think again. He notes that there are cognitive as well as social benefits associated with continuing to work in some capacity or another, be that in a part-time capacity, a full-time capacity, or on a consulting basis. On the face of it, this seems perfectly reasonable. The cognitive benefits, use it or lose it, as one expert so crudely put it. The social ones, through work you'll be surrounded by friends, colleagues, coworkers, and you'll have a community of a sort around you. As I say, completely innocuous sounding. Until you look beneath the hood, so to say, and find the deeper significance. Around the same time, a woman wrote to me explaining that she had been, for many years, a research professor at a university and had had to retire owing to the increasingly worse condition brought about by her lupus. She wrote, "Sometimes I feel useless, even though I know better." She goes on, "Our culture has no room for leisure with dignity, otium con dignitate in the Latin." And she's right. If you're not working in some capacity or another today, you're socially invisible, socially irrelevant, perhaps even socially obsolete. More succinctly put, if you're not working in what I call the work society, you may not even exist. Together then, these cultural artifacts suggest not just that our lives are framed by work, but also that our lives are framed by a long-standing belief that we, that you and I, just are essentially workers now. I borrow the term total work from the late German philosopher Joseph Pieper, a man who coined it in 1947, but 2 years after the end of the Second World War. Now, Pieper was no Pollyanna. He clearly saw that 80% of buildings in major cities had been destroyed by Allied forces. Therefore, the West German people had not only cities, but also lives to rebuild. As a consequence, work would indeed be the order of the day. Still, against the grain, Pieper argues that contemplation, the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, must come first. We must ask, who are we? How did we get here? What responsibilities do we have for all of this? And how can we possibly put our lives together? Tragically, these questions go unasked, and his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, is summarily forgotten. Following Pieper's example, I want to define total work in the following way. Total work is the process by which human beings are transformed into capital W, workers and nothing else, as more and more aspects of life are transformed into work. Put in different terms, under the regime of total work, we come to believe that we just are human agents in the way that we stand in the world, human agents who express this form of agency in and through the work we do on ourselves and in the world. Over the years, I've discovered there are a number of important features of total work, and yet 3 I want to single out for this talk this evening. According to the first feature, the centrality thesis, Work is the center around which the rest of human life turns. Everything else thereby being relegated to secondary, peripheral, or marginal status. I invite you to confirm this in your experience, to see whether throughout the course of your life, work has indeed been central in most cases, the rest of life, somehow or another, peripheral. Now, according to the second thesis, the subservience thesis, everything else in human life comes to be not only put in the service of, but also made to be subservient to work. I invite you to confirm this too in your own experience, but here is one simple everyday example. Almost every day we hear about rests or breaks being good for us, but they're good for us in the sense they help us to be, it is said, more and more productive or more and more creative at the work that we do. Rarely have I heard someone say, just rest. Just be still. That is an end in itself. The more you think about it, the more you realize that more things in life are put in the service of the work that we do. And now the third and final feature. According to the cultural forgetfulness thesis, all other ways of living that existed before work took over the world vanish almost completely from cultural memory. See tonight whether you can really call to mind the daily rhythms of late medieval Europe. See whether or not you can call to mind right here, ancient Greece and its glorious city-states. See closer to home whether you can call to mind any vibrant, living, indigenous culture that is not operating according to the dictates of total work. I submit that I don't think that we can. And this is because total work operates not just by colonizing our discourse, the ways in which we speak, but also because it tends to occlude from view other ways of living that no longer seem available to us. And so if I may anthropomorphize for a second, I would say that total work has an aspiration of a kind. And that aspiration is to see itself fully realized in every nook and in every corner of the world, regardless of how this takes place. Paradoxically, however, it does not do so directly by announcing its presence to us, but rather indirectly, in and through various manifestations, which I tried to point to in my Magic Rooms thought experiment. The various ways in which we lead our lives according to terms like busyness and tasks and projects and meetings and careers and career fulfillment and so on and so forth. Now then, if total work is more or less as I've described, and furthermore, if it is one cause of unnecessary human suffering, then it behooves us to ask ourselves, how did it come about? How did we get here? How did work take over the world? The story I wish to tell, the brief story of how work took over the world and made us who we think we are, takes place in three separate but related parts. In the first part, I'll return to the medieval period, where I'll discuss the traditional peasant view of manual labor, which will be set over and against a monastic innovation. It will be from the monasteries, actually, that we get a first, albeit partial, positive articulation of the role of work in life. From here, I'll go forward to the Protestant Reformation, where I'll discuss Protestant critics and Protestant reformers, both of whom end up articulating quite a positive view of work. On their understanding, work becomes an inherent good unto itself. And from there, I'll turn to the Victorian period, where my hero, Thomas Carlyle, a Calvinist and a Scotsman, ends up expounding the gospel of work. At which point, I'm going to gather together these three contributions or threads and house them under a concept I call the work ideal. It is the work ideal that I believe in our digital age, the one that we're on the cusp of, may be under attack, and with consequences for how we actually live our lives. Let me come then to the medieval period first. I think we must take it as axiomatic that until the birth of the modern world, work was in most places and in most times the lowliest human concern. It is for this reason that ancient Greeks were willing to justify the existence of chattel slavery so that the aristocrats would be freed up to devote themselves to lives of leisurely contemplation and political engagement. And it is also for this reason that clerics as well as aristocrats living in the medieval period, which comprised no more than 1 to 2% of the overall population, were also willing to justify the existence of a peasant class, which was tasked with doing all the laboring in the fields so that clerics and aristocrats would be freed up to devote themselves to things not related to work. The traditional view of manual labor has been that it is contemptible, lowly, servile, a curse, a burden, and in the words of one French medieval scholar, penance for original sin. Though peasants themselves are not literate, we can at least deduce they probably held this traditional view themselves. Indeed, quite apart from their moments of happiness and their joys, their lives must have been filled with plenty of toil and hardship. It is against this backdrop that the medieval monasteries end up creating a crack or a fissure in this commonsensical view of manual labor. Indeed, the monasteries upheld 3 related commitments: to work in the form of manual labor, to prayer, and to contemplation. According to one scholar, George Ovid, in his book, The Restoration of Perfection, they actually upheld 2 related views of manual labor, 2 positive views at that. In the first place, they upheld the view that work was good for you. Good insofar as it allowed each monk to work on his soul, so to speak, so that by that means he could come closer to God. Indeed, work allowed each monk to cultivate the salient virtues of patience, forbearance, obedience, and above all, humility. It is in this sense that the monastery was, as Ovid rightly put it, a workshop of the soul. And I think it is also from this tradition that we inherit the idea that work is good for us inasmuch as it allows us to build our characters. And in the second place, monastics upheld the further view that work was good for the community. The work that I, as a monk, did allowed me, through acts of generosity and charity, to give unto other monks as well as to those who dwelled beyond the monastic walls. So far, so good. There are a few implications to be drawn from this brief discussion of the monastic innovation. Firstly, it simply is not true, however, that monks held to the centrality of work. Work indeed played a role, an infrastructural role in their lives, but it was worship of God, clearly, that was central, and therefore contemplation and prayer were more fundamental indeed. And secondly, they advanced what in philosophy would be called an instrumental theory or instrumental view of manual labor. That is to say, manual labor was good for you insofar as it helped to further other spiritual aims that were ends in themselves. But it wasn't the case that work itself was an intrinsic good. To see how work became an intrinsic good, we'll need to turn to the Protestant Reformation, which I do now. The years 1536 to 1541 mark a defining, indeed radical moment in English history. One of the most radical moments in English history, according to one scholar. For during that period, Henry VIII, then King of England, ends up dissolving all the monasteries. To be sure, he must have had political as well as religious reasons for doing so. And yet it turns out that he was also highly influenced by the Protestant reformer and Renaissance humanist Erasmus. And he was not alone. Other Protestant countries around this time, such as Sweden and Denmark, also dissolved their monasteries. And so we must ask, after over a 1,000-year run as an institution, what was so potent about Protestant critiques that led to the demise of monasteries? And what implications might that have, it turns out, for our own lives today? I find in John Calvin's book, The Institutes, 3 seminal critiques of the monastic tradition. Firstly, he writes, the monasteries had grown decadent. Secondly, the monasteries were places of idleness and contemplation, indeed of idle contemplation. And thirdly, the monks had begun to puff themselves up with pride, believing themselves to be morally and religiously superior to all other laypersons. Let's take each claim in turn. Concerning the charge of decadence, Erasmus observes in a letter to a friend that they had gone on to do some empty ceremonialism in the monasteries. They were observing only the letter, the dead letter of Christianity, and not its spirit. We might say today that they're going through the motions and believing that's a thing itself. This is in keeping with the observation of one monastic scholar who holds that monasteries go through a monastic cycle. Some centuries prior, they begin with elan, with ascetic rigor, with devotion and piety, only centuries later to devolve into decadence. Perhaps the 1500s just was such a period of decadence for the monasteries. Concerning the second charge of idle contemplation, I believe that John Calvin had 2 related things in mind. In the first place, he must have been referring to St. John's formulation or injunction, if you do not work, famous line, if you do not work, then you shall not eat. As I understand it, until quite recently, till that time, this was taken more liberally to mean if humankind does not work, then human beings shall not eat. But the more literal interpretation wins out, such that it reads, if each person does not work, then each person shall not eat. And around this time, the monasteries had indeed grown decadent in the sense that they'd begun to hire out daily laborers to do the labor for them, or some of it anyway. Now, in the second place, Calvin was also referring to the simple fact of being a monk. That is to say, they simply did not have the duties and responsibilities that parish priests had on behalf of their communities. Both charges here, I believe, amount to a profound case against the monasteries. They simply were not worldly enough. Which leads me to the third charge. Concerning the case of puffed up pride, Erasmus writes somewhere that, to be sure, the monastic life is but one virtuous life among many others, and yet it is only one type of life worth living. To our modern ears, this sounds completely uncontroversial, trivially true, in fact. For us, value pluralism holds the day. That is, we believe that each person is free to live his life as he or she sees fit, provided that he or she does not harm anyone else while doing so. But this is not, I think, what Erasmus had in mind. And I think when we bring these critiques together, we found a few vital implications. To begin with, they end up amounting, here as elsewhere, to a complete discrediting or delegitimization of the monastery, of a place that had been living in this precarious position, not quite otherworldly, not quite this worldly. Additionally, it also amounts, and this is important for my purposes, to a discrediting of the contemplative life. That contemplative life had been held like a seedling within the monastery for thousands of years, and now it was being attacked. Now, what we think would happen at this point in history is not what actually happens. What we think would happen would be that a critique of monasticism in general and of the contemplative life in particular, we would think that such a critique of this quasi-otherworldliness would, in short order, lead to a certain kind of self-interested materialism. And this self-interested materialism would, in time, pave the way, for example, to a defense of capitalism, the spirit of capitalism. But as it turns out, this is not actually what happened. What happened instead is far more interesting. According to the sociologist Max Weber in his marvelous treatise, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, what ends up happening is that each Protestant reformer and each Protestant practitioner ends up taking the asceticism upon him or herself. Each Protestant practitioner becomes, as Weber put it, a monk with worldly occupations. In other words, a monk living in the world. And this is just fascinating. Now, Weber's question in his important treatise is the following. Is there some kind of religious ethos or outlook or sensibility that is not necessary for it, but is highly conducive to the emergence of the spirit of capitalist endeavor? He thinks he has found his answer, or the beginning of one, in certain strands of Calvinist theology and practice. Yet his question, it turns out, is not my own. But I think his treatise can help me answer my question, which, recall, was how did work go from being so contemptible, truly, for so long, to becoming so sacrosanct, almost holy, in such short order? How on earth did that happen? There are three questions that I think I can now answer based on my reading of Weber's text. The first question, what for Protestants is work? Work for Protestants is not drudgery, not mere toil. Rather, it is a calling. Something God is calling each of us to do. Second question, who am I? Answer, I, a Protestant, am a devout worker, working on behalf of God to further God's created world. Third question, what is the aim of my life? What is it that God is calling me to do? God is calling me, by means of the work I do, to sacrifice myself for the sake of the life task, as Weber puts it. In time, I believe, this last idea is going to transform itself such that when it comes our time, we'll start to think that our lives, writ large, just are tasks to be completed, or just are projects to be fulfilled. This is why some of my conversation partners like to say, I don't want to leave unfinished business when I die. I don't want my life to be incomplete in that way. Where else did they get this idea from? There are three important implications I'd like to draw from my brief reading of Weber's text. First of all, in Protestants' hands, in time, insofar as God is calling each of us to have a calling, we will come to believe that every able-bodied person, every able-minded person of a certain age is expected to work. In the 19th century, this will mean the right to work. And in the 20th century, this will be common sense, as we assume that full-time gainful employment in a labor force is precisely what is expected of each human being. Second of all, Protestants, in a way that is unheard of, took the spirit of asceticism upon themselves, making it their own. How else do we explain the fact that all these human beings today, ourselves included, are actually able to perform tasks and complete projects that are of a completely mundane nature? How is it possible for us to continue to sacrifice ourselves in a very daily way in order to complete things that we must admit to ourselves from the viewpoint of the universe, so to say, are not that important? It's only because we have a certain kind of Protestant work ethic, a certain kind of Protestant asceticism, that any of this becomes possible. And third of all, and most importantly, for the first time in human history, or at least the first time that I'm aware of, work itself becomes meaningful. Nietzsche says somewhere that for someone who has a why, almost any how is bearable. In this case, we should take that to mean for someone who has a why, almost any how is redeemed, justified, affirmed. And that affirmation comes in the form of what Weber calls an absolute end in itself. Work thereby becomes an absolute end in itself, an intrinsic good, something that is good into and of itself, something needing no further justification for existence or for our own. This is the remarkable Protestant thesis, the one I believe that we are still in key part living with. But this is not the end of the story, although it is a good part of the story, or an interesting part of the story. To see the final part, we'll need to go forward to the Victorian period, where we'll find the gospel of work in the hands of another Calvinist, Thomas Carlyle. In 1843, Carlyle writes a book called Past and Present, which is more or less an elaboration upon the state of work in the Victorian period during the rise of industrialization. Now, Carlyle is by no means unsympathetic to the plight of working class people at this time. He's able to observe with his own eyes that their working conditions are in some cases horrendous. He's also able to see that their lives are at least cramped, if not degraded. Indeed, he is no fan of early industrialization, for he calls it mammonism and industrialism. And yet, in a second important twist in history, he doesn't do what we might expect him to do. He doesn't critique work and subscribe to leisure or religion or something else that would be higher to work. Quite the contrary, he doubles down, claiming that true work is not work. What could he possibly mean? According to the scholar Rob Breton in his book Gospel and Grit, Carlyle draws in a distinction between homo economicus and homo faber. Homo economicus is a figure that you and I are quite accustomed to at this point in time. According to this understanding, each human being is a calculating, rational creature seeking his or her own utility. Therefore, it would be true on this understanding what one utilitarian philosopher said: love of labor is a contradiction in terms. Carlyle sees the degraded working class people as being examples of homo economicus. Yet, homo faber is not homo economicus. What then is homo faber? Homo faber is human beings understood as making creatures, ones who are working on the world while working on themselves. In this sense, Carlyle could say that true work is sacred. Laborare est orare. Work is prayer. And in this respect, what he's up to is quite fascinating because he's completely changing the medieval monastic formulation, which was from the Latin work, comma, pray, comma, and contemplate. Never did they say work is contemplation or work is prayer, but it was so for Carlyle. True work, he says, is at once noble and sacred. It is noble in the sense that his heroic spirits, these sea captains and potters and artisans he describes in this book, will, through their own efforts, take chaos and disharmony in the world and transform it into harmony and order. And it is sacred in the sense that they do so for the sake of bringing into greater relief God's created world. In short, this then is Carlyle's gospel of work. And what it means is that work in his hands becomes a summum bonum, a supreme or highest good, and therefore is able to reside among the other gods and goddesses that you and I are more familiar with: love and beauty, goodness and peace, happiness and wisdom. As I see it, Carlyle has taken the value of work to such a high pitch that from here we can go no further. We come then to the point at which it's important to gather together these three contributions made in these three respective periods. If we do so, then we can gather them up and put them beneath a concept I call the work ideal. I believe the work ideal just is the combination of the instrumental goodness, the intrinsic goodness, and the supreme goodness of work. And what's important for our purposes here is that I believe that we've been trying to fulfill the work ideal throughout the course of our lives while agonizing over the very possibility that we cannot do so, at least not in full. Yet the work ideal faces three shadows inherent within itself. The first shadow comes in response to the instrumental goodness of work. Perhaps late at night or early in the morning, you might be gripped by a question. Am I lacking depth in my soul and my life owing to a single-minded cultivation of work-like virtues, prudence, industriousness, frugality, and the like? Is it only the case that contemplation and introspection can afford me breadth and depth and vastness in my soul? Is something missing in my life? The second shadow comes in response to the inherent goodness of work. Late at night or early in the morning, you may not be able to help but feel an existential doubt. Is this work what I was born for? Is this what life is fundamentally about? Is this all there is? And if this is not all there is, then what more is there? And the third shadow comes in response to the supreme goodness of work. And it invites us to ask, might work be an imposter? Does it really deserve to reside among all these highest goods, truth and beauty, love and goodness and happiness? Or has it been, at the very best, making believe, pretending that it is an ultimate, final, or supreme good? These three shadows pose a fundamental threat to the possibility that the work ideal could be realized. And yet they are not the biggest threat. The biggest threat, I think, will come organically as we enter more fully into the digital age and as our children enter more fully into this age. We may find what I'm calling an existential enigma rather than an existential crisis. It's a little more philosophical rendering. In his book, How to Be Human in the Digital Economy, the New Zealand philosopher Nicholas Agar suggests that we do well to make a key distinction between the social economy and the digital economy. While the digital economy values efficiency above all else, the social economy, in his words, values humanness above all else. It values our natural gregariousness as social animals. And he thinks that we would do well to maintain kinds of work, specifically jobs, so that we can come into closer social contact with one another. I have no reason to doubt his claims, but I want to set them off to the side in order to entertain a second thought experiment. Not quite as jazzy as magic rooms, but important, I think. I wonder what might happen if artificial intelligence, in the form of machine or deep learning, or in some other future form for that matter, were to be so good at what it is that it does, that not only did it outcompete human beings at various and sundry tasks, at various and sundry projects in the present, but it also was able to outcompete human beings in terms of efficiency when it came to future tasks and future projects. It's merely a thought experiment, but I'll go on. If this were to come to pass, what might this mean for us? What if, en masse, the work ideal, as I conceive it, is no longer universalizably realizable? What if, more important still, we could no longer believe that we are all only, or above all, workers? What would that mean for us? Would we be lost? Would we lose ourselves? Would this mean a culture-wide tragedy? Possibly, but I don't think that it has to. I'm sanguine enough to believe that this kind of existential enigma, one posed to each of us, to each of our hearts, also presents us with an opportunity, with an opening, indeed with an invitation. I would like to present my utopia, which is no more than a sketch on the back of an envelope, as it were. Not because I think it's necessarily feasible or infeasible, but because I think it helps us to expand our minds and exercise our imaginations. Remember, early in this talk, I suggested that one of the key features of total work is cultural forgetfulness. And so it behooves us to begin, once again, to imagine what the world could be like if it were understood in completely different terms. Without further ado, then, my utopia. My utopia is divided into two basic parts or domains: sustaining life, or infrastructure, and the good life, that for the sake of which we live. Sustaining life makes possible the good life, but is not the good life itself. Furthermore, the good life in my utopia is no more but also no less than an expression of leisure. We think we know what leisure is, but I'm not sure that we do. I'll come to that. But first, sustaining life. Mine is divided into two separate but related domains: human work and machine work. In my utopia, machines would be automated in such a way that they would take care of the tasks that are mere drudgery. That is, the tasks that are involved in physical labor that otherwise would harm a human being or wear him or her down, as well as the mindless mind work tasks that you and I are probably familiar with. AI, magically so, would take care of that. But you'll also notice, after this long history and critique of total work, that there is room for human work in my utopia. It's just that it plays a much more modest, less ambitious role here. Vaguely put on purpose, work here is undertaken in some ways, at some times, during certain parts of our lives, and according to different varying rhythms. To say this is also to say that work in my utopia functions in accordance with more natural rhythms. And it would abide by three fundamental virtues. Care, we would care for what comes to mind and what comes to our hands. Responsibility, we would be responsible for what comes out of our mind and out of our hands. And fineness, we would want whatever it is that we make or do to be finely wrought, to be well made, to be well thought, and this for its own sake. Yet, human work is also a bit like good pipes, bringing water into a house. It's not the reason why you buy the house, but you need good pipes. Similarly, work in my utopia helps to bring water, as it were, into the good life, to which I return now. The good life is divided into two parts: the vita activa, the active life, and the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life. The active life is itself divided into two parts: human ecology and civic engagement. In my utopia, we would want to cultivate the earth in accordance with biodynamic or regenerative systems design. What this effectively would mean is that in time we would begin to think of our relationship with the earth as if it were one big composting over and over and over again. But what of politics? My utopia would be hyper-local and hyper-global. It would be hyper-local in the sense that beautiful city-states, human-scaled, small in size rather, would flourish, with the result that human beings would learn again how to be political animals, as Aristotle put it. They would engage in civic participation in order to bring about the common good. And it would also be hyper-global. Federations and networks would be set up in such a way to tackle global problems at a global level. I'm thinking, for example, of climate change. And now I come to the crown jewel of the good life, by which I mean the contemplative life. The contemplative life would be expressed in four related modes. In the mode of art, for it is art that is conducive to experiencing, contemplating, and creating the beautiful. In the mode of philosophy, for it is philosophy that is conducive to experiencing wonderment, as well as embodying wisdom. In the mode of science, for it is science that comes up with empirical and theoretical knowledge of the universe. And in the mode of, call it what you will, religion or spirituality, for religion or spirituality enables us to come into greater, closer, more intimate contact with an abiding reality. That is, with the interwoven, interconnected nature of all things and beings. And all this, I say, is an expression of leisure. And leisure is not what you think. It is not spare time or free time or downtime or weekends. By no means. Leisure isn't even in time, as it were. Leisure, rather, is a condition of the soul, a disposition of our being, a way of being in the world in which we are radically, widely open to apprehending reality. More succinctly put, leisure is openness to what there is. And so after all this, after this exposition, after this history, I want to leave you with a question, and it is this one. If I am not a worker, and if you are not a worker, and if he is not a worker, and if she is not a worker, and in short, if all of us are not workers, then who really am I? Who fundamentally are you? And who, in the final analysis, are we? It is only now, only just now, only after this historical and philosophical investigation of the nature, history, and reality of total work, can the genuine inquiry into who we really are begin? Thank you. I believe we have a little while for questions.
Hi there. This is not a microphone. It is a microphone. Oh, it is? Can you hear me? Hi. I think one of the things that we're challenged with is boredom. And not that Freud, who was a genius, still is passé, but I particularly like his definition of happiness, and it works for me. That is work, play, and love. So I tell my patients that we need people to do everything, whether it's bagging at the grocery, and I appreciate them. I think that everybody should know that they're appreciated for whatever work they do, and we certainly don't want to be bored. Oh, that wasn't a question.
It's a beautiful comment. Thank you for it. I like it. Do you want to?
Ready? Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for a very engaging, extremely engaging talk. And then I have this question in my mind because I came home in first grade and told my dad I wanted to be a teacher. I never changed my mind. I loved every minute that I did it. It was very challenging. But on the other hand, my question for you is, how would you analyze the welfare cycle and how it continues for many from generation to generation?
Well, that's a hard question. Let me start with your first remark about wanting to be a teacher. I didn't go through this in the talk. There was much that was left out, but I would say there are 4 conceptions we have of work. I'll make this very brief. The first is understood in terms of labor, as I used the term during the talk. That is, it's mere toil, mere effortful toil. I think we all have experiences with this still today. The second conception is the one that's more or less been lost in modernity, or largely lost, and that's that it's a survivalist conception. You would do the kind of work that you needed to do in order to support yourself and your family or those who depend upon you. This is, I would call, a neutral conception. Now we have 2 positive conceptions that are very modern in nature. The third one I hinted at, which comes from Genesis. It holds that work is the way in which you bring something into the world. So we talk about creative work, we talk about fulfilling work, or we think about entrepreneurship as a particular instantiation of that idea. The fourth one comes out of the Protestant tradition, and it holds that work is a vocation or a calling. Now, it's not wrong to say that some people, maybe even in this audience, have had vocations or callings. It's not really the critique I was after. The critique is after the universalizability of callings. I just don't think it's possible for most human beings to come into the world at age 3 or 5 and think that their very reason for being is to be a teacher or a doctor or something else. So that's the first remark in relation to that point about being a teacher. As for the welfare state, I guess what I would say is really interesting is that, and this is not quite to answer your question, so I'm going to be a little cagey, if you will, is to think about those who are left behind, or those who are, conceptually speaking, left out of the modern work world, the modern labor force. In the medieval period, there actually was a place for the beggar, or even if you think about a Buddhist tradition, there's actually a place for someone who's living a religious life and is begging, right? This person has suggested that I'm not a worker, but I need householders to support me. Until very recently, we've had, not perfect by any means, but we've had licenses. We've allowed for people who can't quite figure out how to make a living in a particular sort of way, namely being gainfully employed. And I speak with a number of people, not just entrepreneurs and tech executives, but I used to speak with a lot of people who are artists. And artists have an uncanny ability not to want to be gainfully employed, right? So one of the ways we can begin to exhibit a certain level of compassion is to think about how a universal system of gainful employment, that everyone ought to be a jobber. I left this part out of the talk, but everyone has to be a jobber, possibly with a career. This is just not really amenable to the wide variety of human beings that have come into being. As a consequence, a more humane question might be, is it possible to figure out ways of making a living today that don't necessarily require jobs? Universal basic income is one such idea. It may not be a good idea. It may be. Since we have someone clapping, it may be. I'll change my mind. But it at least points to the possibility that not everyone was cut out for a particular way of working. It's not quite answering your question, but at least it kind of goes around it. It's like waltzing around.
On that artful answer, let's thank our speaker.